there is widespread anger and distrust of the National Guard's intervention here, mainly because they are behaving as an armed escort of the police to terrorize the city.
Hey, remember, man.
25th, George Floyd was murdered by police over a crime of poverty and the report of a fake $20 bill having been used somewhere in the area. This is utterly disgusting, especially while we're entering into a deep economic recession and crisis, and nearly 40 million people are unemployed in the US right now. But what's happening here in Minneapolis is a working class rebellion headed by young people of color. The youth have fearlessly confronted heavily armed police officers during 24-hour protests and occupations. And this has truly sparked a new wave of the Black freedom movement, which is spreading nationally and internationally with solidarity protests. Across the country, from top to bottom, cities are now being rocked by protests in cities where the Democratic Party has dominated for years. The visceral anger at police and the racism of the system has put on full display the utter failure of the Democratic Party establishment. The Democratic Party runs the city of Minneapolis and is currently running our state, and they are working overtime to repress the protests and channel the movement into more established channels that have routinely failed Black and brown people. But we must be clear. The direct action and protests that have happened have registered victories already. 1 week ago, the officer who ruthlessly murdered George Floyd was arrested and indicted. This was following 2 nights of protests, including the movement forcing the police to retreat, and the youth took over the police station, burning it to the ground. The media is emphasizing looting in the wake of the political establishment's inaction. But in addition to people looting, we see numerous working class families filling their cars with diapers and food. And most people continue to wear masks on the protests, but social distancing has become less of a concern. The priority has become building and strengthening the movement and the need for justice. We also need to be clear about who is actually destroying our city. It's the racist police, the political establishment, and big corporations. The liberal establishment has not fought for us while the economy crumbled with the trigger of the COVID crisis. The elite have profited over $434 billion during coronavirus, while Black communities see 3 times higher rates of infection of COVID and 6 times higher death rates. Some of this is because so many of them are frontline workers who have been fighting, demanding, protesting the necessary personal protective equipment that so frequently the corporate interests and shareholders for the hospitals have refused to provide. This means we need to build a political struggle against the establishment, and I think immediately speaks to the need to nationalize our healthcare system and the supply chains under democratic workers' control so that we can meet the needs of society and not the profits of the billionaire class. We must also be clear that any destruction in Minneapolis is the fault of the Democratic establishment because they could have immediately arrested and charged the 4 officers. But they instead decided to mobilize state violence against working class Black communities and youth protesters. Right now, the media claims that the protests are being directed by outside agitators or anarchists or Antifa. And Trump reportedly has now called Antifa a hate group. But anyone who has participated in the Minneapolis rebellion knows that this is absolute nonsense. How could outside agitators be the key factor in protests that have spread to every major city? What's happening is truly an uprising of working class people with youth of color at the forefront. In fact, working class people, especially people of color getting organized in our communities, have been most effective at stopping vigilante violence. Minnesota and Minneapolis in particular has one of the highest populations of Somali immigrants. And at a Somali mall made up almost entirely of East African vendors within about a mile of where George Floyd was murdered, the vendors banded together and ran out a group of suspicious men who were acting sketchy. And you know what? The Somali community managed to do that and protect their community infrastructure without using rubber bullets and without using pepper spray, like the police and the National Guard. Minnesota's Governor Walz has called in the National Guard to break up the protests. And in so doing, he actually said, "We are bringing the full force of goodness and righteousness to restore order onto our streets." I mean, this is utterly ludicrous. There is widespread anger and distrust of the National Guard's intervention here, mainly because they are behaving as an armed escort of the police to terrorize the city. And they have yet to arrest even one white supremacist, despite the fear-mongering coming from the establishment. There are videos going around showing that the Guard actually allowed and escorted the police through areas where the police then shot at people on their porches who were sitting outside after curfew. But the movement continues, and hundreds of people are defying the curfew every night with the main demand to arrest and charge all 4 officers involved in the murder of George Floyd. However, it has to be noted that there is a risk that ongoing protests without a sustained, coordinated structure can lose momentum. Socialist Alternative calls for coordinated mass days of action that involve youth, communities of color, and the wider working class. A well-organized movement can begin to address the structural racism and inequality that surrounds police violence by taking up demands for social programs, public education, and permanently affordable social housing. The liberal establishment has proven itself incapable of combating the right. They say some utopian things about abolishing the police. But police violence is part and parcel of the capitalist system, which rests on structural racism and inequality. This is why we must expand the struggle to tax the rich, to invest in green jobs, social programs, public education, and again, permanently affordable social housing. On the ground, we are also in Minneapolis calling for the launch of an elected community-led restructuring of the MPD, including an elected civilian board with real teeth that has authority over hiring, firing, and reviewing the budget priorities, with the power to subpoena, which would mean actually calling people to have to speak to their crimes in front of the civilian board. We think that this is a model that could be spread nationally. Because the reality is that as long as a handful of billionaires exist, there will be police under capitalism. This is why we're in the struggle for the total transformation of society, which requires that we wage a political struggle against the establishment to dismantle the police, and in the fight for the liberation of all people oppressed under capitalism. It's clear that we are now entering into a new phase of explosive struggle. While we resist state repression against this rebellion, we can lay the seeds for a wider movement this summer and beyond. We need to take determined, direct action to stop housing evictions, which we know are coming. We can stand with our immigrant neighbors to stop Trump's deportations. We can mobilize organized and unorganized workers against unsafe working conditions. We must fight to fund public education and social services, not the cops. And we are building the mass international struggle to fight climate catastrophe, which we will still need to wage a battle against. Young and working class people are moving into action, and we should continue this fight against not only racist policing, but also all the injustices inherent in this system of exploitation and oppression. I'm going to end with an indication of what's possible with an example of the role of the labor movement and the role that they have played so far. A member of Socialist Alternative named Adam Birch is a bus driver organized with the Amalgamated Transit Union Local 1005 in Minneapolis. And when the drivers here were told to coordinate with the police department to shuttle protesters to jail, he wrote a post encouraging his coworkers to refuse. In that post, he said, "As a transit worker and union member, I refuse to transport my class and radical youth to jail because an injury to one is an injury to all. The police murdered George Floyd, and the protest against it is completely justified and should continue until all of their demands are met." This led to bus drivers in New York City taking similar action and a network of rank-and-file union members organizing justice for George Floyd, with dozens of locals issuing solidarity statements. Additionally, elected city council member in Seattle and Socialist Alternative member Shama Sawant was the only vote against relaxing oversight on the Seattle Police Department budget, and consistently fights to fund affordable social housing with cuts to that bloated police budget. Recently, in her speech in solidarity with Justice for George Floyd, she called for real structural reforms to policing that have teeth, taxing billionaires to build permanently affordable housing and a green jobs program. But unfortunately, this stands in contrast to even the left-wing figures in the Democratic Party, including Bernie Sanders and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who have done little more than issue statements of support for the protests. We need more elected officials like Shama Sawant who actually side with the movement when challenged, which is also why we are fighting for a new independent party built of, by, and for working class people in the United States. This means we must break with the Democratic Party, which is tied by a million threads to billionaires, corporate interests, and the police. Socialists, by contrast, like what was shown with that initial call from the bus drivers and Shama's statement, are pointing to the critical role of a united multiracial working class in fighting racism. To win justice for George Floyd, we need mass coordinated protests and days of action, prepared to resist attempts by the military to suppress the demonstrations. The wider working class, and especially the labor movement, should fully mobilize its membership to these actions, and we should find ways to disrupt the military's use of our workplaces to suppress calls for justice. If this military violence continues, the unions should discuss making immediate preparations for a one-day general strike, which I believe could garner widespread support. The sympathy amongst broader society right now is on the side of the protests. Thousands of ordinary people have gotten organized to clean up in networks and community councils to talk about what next steps are possible. But truly, the whole system is guilty, and as Malcom X said, you can't have capitalism without racism. To win lasting change, the fight against police racism and the corporate political establishment must be expanded into a fight against the capitalist system itself, and the fight for a socialist world free of oppression. Solidarity.